That's actually not the pleasurable part. There you go. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you our first keynote. Our first keynote is Michael Bolton from Toronto, Canada, an excellent country. Also where I'm from. Really? I know, it's shocking. I'm from USA according to my badge, but I fixed it by putting a Canadian flag. Anyway, Michael Bolton is our first keynote. He is one of the now 3 instructors for rapid software testing. I'm also one of them. But, okay, it's not about me, it's about Michael. Michael and James Block developed the rapid software testing course over the last large number of years. Michael is a consultant, a fantastic tester, a prolific blogger, and very well known in the testing community, and I think we're quite lucky to have him here. So let's give a round of applause for Michael Bolton.
Thanks, Paul. You are lucky to have me here, but not half as lucky as I am to have me here. That's the way I see it. I walked in this evening, or yesterday evening, and I felt like I had died and gone to heaven. Or maybe hell, because my family's not here, my daughter's not here, and if it were heaven, my wife and my daughter would be here. But at least we're all in the same place. Us. This is something else that's interesting. I guess I have to find some juice for this. So I'm going to do something a little odd. The last time I gave a talk like this, it was in... where was it? It was Seattle, I guess it was. And something disastrous happened when we swapped machines. All of a sudden the machine just completely died, which is good because it meant that I did the talk without PowerPoint, basically. But I ended up also reading it from notes. Isn't this fun watching this? This is like watching paint dry. It's about that exciting. For you, I'm sure. I'm enjoying myself. That could be important. All right. Cool. So, apropos of what an amazing crowd of people it is here, I look over, I look over this whole landscape of people that have established reputation, who've established community, who've advanced the cause of skilled testing. Many thanks to you for having done that, not just being here, but for having built such a fantastic community. And to the organizers, this intrepid group of Swedes, what an amazing idea to have this in this sort of retreat space where we can all get together and talk about things. And I'm really miffed because, well, quite frankly, they didn't call me when they scheduled the date. And so I'm off at 3 o'clock this afternoon to go on something even weirder. I'm going on to a cruise, a testing cruise tonight, hosted by, I think, the Norwegian branch of the ISTQB. What study in contrast, right? However, let's talk about this. When I first gave this talk, it was titled "If it's not context-driven, you can't do it here." It's actually important to me to have you know, for you to be aware, that the title of the talk was meant to be ironic. Now, I really worry that people didn't actually understand that or take that seriously. So I just want to emphasize that for the record. The role of the scapegoat in Western literature. And, it's just unbelievably diverse and interesting. Well, in 2008, they produced this magnificent series called How to Think About Science, which I've been rabbiting onto for years, to anybody who will listen and a whole bunch of people who won't. The first episode of that series, the first interview, because it's a series of interviews with scientists, sociologists of science, philosophers. There's at least one magician who is interviewed for this. A specialist on fisheries management, who was the subject of a weekend testing session several years ago. The first episode, though, is about controversy in science, and it's about the role that the controversy plays. It features this guy, Simon Shafford, who is a historian of science in Cambridge, and he talked about this subject of study that he and a colleague, Stephen Chapin, worked on. And this was the thermonuclear argument between Robert Boyle and Thomas Hobbes, almost exactly 350 years ago today. Boyle was on a mission. He was assigned a mission by William Harvey, who had discovered the circulation of blood, and the task was to try to figure out what happens when the blood goes by the lungs. Now, Boyle figured it had something to do with the fact that people breathe in and out. And so Boyle said, let's do experiments on the air. Experiments were kind of a new idea at that point, because up to then, the history of science was involved with observation. Aristotle had laid down a charter almost 2,000 years earlier, and people didn't really question what it was. They just went out and sort of looked at stuff. Well, in the middle of the 17th century, in the middle of the 1600s, people got very excited about the idea proposed by Francis Bacon that you could do experiments. You could change the way things were. You could take the way reality was and you could distort it in some way. You could change it. And the most advanced, the most sophisticated, the most prestigious, the most wonderful instrument by which you could do that in those days was the air pump. All the swells had an air pump. Well, actually, not very many people had an air pump because they were incredibly complicated to make. They were, they didn't work very well. They took an immense amount of what we would nowadays call engineering. So that people who were studying the way the world worked saw, as Schaffer describes it, an intersection between engineering and art. You could actually, between science and observation and art, you could actually do stuff. And so Boyle said, something that has now become so imbued in the way we test that we've almost forgotten what a significant thing it is. Boyle said, if you want to understand the properties of something, it's a really cool idea to get rid of it and see what happens when you take it out. I remember at Quarterdeck in the 1990s when I worked there, one of the things that we did lots, one of the things that our programmers and our testers did lots, was to change the name of a file and see what happened when the operating system couldn't find that file, when the program you were using couldn't find that file. Now that's a test technique that, so far as we know, Boyle was the first one to talk about that in any kind of serious way. Not that other people hadn't been doing it necessarily, but Boyle really focused on that as an approach, and so he sucked the air out of this glass chamber while other stuff was inside it. Polished bits of marble, which would fall apart or stick together when they basically wanted to know whether that would happen. He put in little critters, little animals, to see what effect depriving them of air had, and he came up with a whole body of theory. The idea was that he wanted to produce what he called a matter of fact. Something indisputable. Because he wanted, in addition to doing this experimentation, he wanted to solve this social problem. The social problem was that people would disagree about the way things were. So, how do you get around that? Well, what you do is you make disagreements go away by making facts indisputable. And here's how you do it. First of all, you need instrumentation. You need gear. Stuff that helps to remove complex, messy, fallible humans from the discussion. You don't want the human element to get in the way. You want to as Sir Francis Bacon said, you want to vex nature. And so you get the humans out of the way. Then, you get a bunch of witnesses, bring them in, and have them watch the experiment. Have them watch the experimenter, and the experimenter describes what he's doing at the time, and all the witnesses watch and say, marvelous, marvelous. And then, you write it up. You produce what we would now call a test report. Right? And you do it in a specific style, which Schaffer and Stephen Chapin, in their book Leviathan and the Air Pump, refer to as virtual witnessing. Writing in so dispassionate and so accurate a style that the facts of what actually happened would be indisputable. One of Boyle's contemporaries at the time was a fellow named Thomas Hobbes, who was famous for writing a book called Leviathan, a political figure in the show. He's described as really one of the authors of modernity. He wrote this book, Leviathan, about the role of the state. Hobbes believed that in order to have order in a society, you needed some kind of supreme leader. And that's at least one of the reasons why he looked at Boyle's practice, which Boyle called experimental philosophy, and said, bullshit. He said, there's all kinds of problems with this. This is ridiculous. He says, first of all, it's not philosophy. Philosophy is based on axioms, and then carefully worked out, carefully described, highly reasoned and rational theorems, which you build off the axioms. Yeah. That's what philosophy is all about. You're playing with toys, he said to Boyle. This is like a child's pop gun, and he said, admittedly, more sophisticated and more ingenious, but it's a toy. Because apart from everything else, it leaked. The air pump leaked a lot. They didn't have plastics, they didn't have sophisticated machinery in order to make highly precise stuff. They didn't have rubber. They didn't have any of the stuff that you need in order to get a really good seal, and so they used stuff like leather and cooking oil to try to get a good seal on this stuff, and it leaked like crazy. And Boyle knew that, but he sort of had to apologize. Now, this whole business of equipment that doesn't quite work as well as we want, would this be familiar to any modern-day tester? Ever encountered that? Hobbes' argument was, when it comes to trusting your equipment, you can't suck and blow at the same time. Sorry, that's the last time I'll do something like that. Another problem that Boyle had with the experiment, or that Hobbes had with the experiments that Boyle did, though, was that the experiments were local. They were happening in a lab. Well, not in a lab. They were happening in drawing rooms of gentlemen in Pall Mall, that kind of thing. And Hobbes said, well, you claim that this should apply universally. How do you know it works everywhere? How do you know it works at the top of the mountain? How do you know that it works very close to the sea? How do you know that it's going to work on the continent the same way as it works here in England? You don't. Until you've done your experiment somewhere else, you don't know that. Are any testers here familiar with the argument that, well, just because it works here doesn't necessarily work there? Another issue that Hobbes brought up was, well, he actually anticipated David Hume by 100 years or so, in saying that, the proof of all this is by induction. In other words, he said, just because it happens this time, how do you know it's going to happen every time? Right? So this is all kind of like the works on my machine sort of argument. And Hobbes was saying, well, just because it works on your machine doesn't mean it's going to work on everybody's machine. One of Hobbes' principal objections, though, was that Boyle's ideas, Boyle's experiments, Boyle's studies were theory-laden. And now in this, he anticipated Thomas Kuhn by about 300 years. He said, you cannot make an observation and then make a conclusion as to what actually happened unless you have already reckoned up what would explain the result. You're starting from an idea, and when you perform this experiment, your explanation is based on the idea that you started from. Again, something that should be familiar to us these days. The biggest problem, though, that Hobbes had with this was that the social problem wasn't solved. Hobbes didn't believe Boyle's results. And he said, there's no reason for anybody to believe the results if they don't believe your theories, they don't believe in your equipment, they don't believe in your explanations for what happened. And of course, the amazing thing about that is that's still going on. Mere evidence doesn't convince people. Knowledge is socially instituted. Knowledge itself is situated in a society, it's situated in a collective. And if one group of people believes something, and another group of people getting on a boat in Norway believes something else, it's the community standard that's going to decide for each one of those groups what's true, which is a very interesting problem. Like many such disputes, this dispute kind of died out. There are lots of reasons for it that we can surmise. One was that Boyle and his colleagues just flat out refused to allow Hobbes to join the Royal Society. Wouldn't let him in. There are a few reasons for that. Hobbes was an exceptionally nasty man on one level. He poked fun at people he disagreed with. He argued extremely viciously, with a great contempt for the people he opposed, although he was quite a jolly guy amongst his own circles. Also, Hobbes was an embarrassingly bad mathematician. That didn't help to get him into the Royal Society in any way. He fell in love with the work of Euclid when he was about 40 years old, and said, this is amazing stuff, wonderful stuff, everybody should think like this. Everybody should think rationally like this, in fact. It was the argument. And you couldn't have an inept mathematician in the Royal Society, not like that. It would be bad for the reputations. And Hobbes wasn't very gentlemanly to this nice Mr. Boyle. So even Hobbes supporters kind of suppressed that, pay attention to his political stuff, and didn't really talk very much about his role in science. But the fact of the matter is, Hobbes' attacks on Boyle forced Boyle and his colleagues to moderate their claims about the truth value in experimental philosophy and what we now call science, to be a little bit more careful, a little bit more circumspect about what they were saying. Interesting, really, because Hobbes, one of the most rational kinds of political philosophers ever, believed deeply in rationality, recognized one thing, that people who decided things based on social premises were themselves fairly irrational. Here we have this great rationalist standing up for the cause of rationality and recognizing that you couldn't have matters of fact that easily because people were under no obligation to act rationally. That which we call a fact is dependent on our context. Ooh. Fast forward 330 years or so, and you'll find yourself smack dab in the middle of the science wars, where something very interesting happened that Schaffer and his colleagues studied. And that is they noticed that science, which had all kinds of wonderful things to say about the scientific method and about how scientists were themselves deeply moral, wise, skeptical, hard-headed, truth seekers, had never actually bothered to question that. And so a bunch of people in the 1980s, students of Thomas Kuhn started to study the way scientists act. And as Schaffer puts it, it's kind of funny. He says, instead of studying Trobriand Islanders, we were studying Californians. Instead of studying Lieniers, we were studying pathologists. And he said one of the things that we wanted to find out was if what scientists said about science was actually true. And he said it didn't take us very long to find out that scientists were not more deeply moral or more deeply skeptical than most other people. He said the really impressive thing about scientists was how good they were not at managing skepticism, but at managing trust. Well, the conclusion was that science was socially constructed, and the result was a complete uproar in the scientific community. Terrific arguments, people yelling at each other through various forms of research and opinion papers, a great hue and cry from scientists who saw the institution of science itself under attack because people were bothering to question science using scientific methods, using the methods of the social sciences, which didn't help with the physicists. The physicists really hated that idea that theories and ideas and stuff could be socially constructed. You can talk to Anders Dinsen about that sort of stuff, and I bet he would be able to tell you a pretty cool story. Similarly, sometime, I think really back in the beginning of this decade, the same kind of controversy started to become echoed in the testing world. What had gone on for science was now going on for testing. And we're still in the middle of that, it seems. The science wars kind of petered out after 15 or 20 years, with a sort of, I think, overall, a kind of reluctant acceptance of the fact that there were social aspects to science, because scientists were being examined using scientific methods. It's interesting because there's still a lot of shouting in testing, but there's not an awful lot of testing being applied to the things that we're shouting about in our controversies. It came down to the creation of schools of software testing. That's one thing that came up. The recognition that there were different approaches to looking at testing, different ways of modeling the testing world, and that those different approaches generated controversy. Now, there's a helpful aspect to this. One is expressed by James Bach, who said that if you have such a thing as schools, it allows you to be a little more circumspect about what you're saying. Saying things like, well, so-and-so comes from a different school of thought than I do, instead of saying so-and-so is an idiot. Which, of course, for some of us is a great temptation in schools. They're helpful if we moderate it that way. On the other hand, schools can, once having been identified, can put labels onto disputes that are social and political and religious to some degree in nature. There is actually a religion which I think maps to, or a religious view at least, that maps to what the context-driven school should be all about, which is very strict agnosticism. But it's a funny thing. Agnostics, I'm one. I'm an agnostic, which is interesting because my wife is atheist, and we're not sure which religion not to bring the children up in. Thank you, Woody Allen. But there's some interesting issues associated with labeling of groups like this. And one of them is that people don't like to be labeled against their will. They don't like to be called stuff by other people. They don't mind labeling themselves. And I'll use controversial words here, so caution, if you don't like controversial language, just cover your ears for a few seconds, and you don't have to listen to it. But black people have called themselves nigger for years. And it's just starting to dissipate. Gay people have called themselves faggot for years. Well, that's all right inside their community, but if you're from outside the community, that's not cool. And I say those things with trepidation because even here, am I allowed even to talk about it? I hope so, but there was at least one complaint at CAST when I did. So people don't like to be labeled when the other guys are putting the label on. They tend not to mind when they come up with their own labels, when they come up with their own names. Those kinds of divisions are interesting because, so far as I know, there's nobody here who is a member of the governing body of the ISTQB. Is that right? Is there anybody who identifies that way? ISEB? Anything like that? Yeah. Well, here we are, supposedly in a context-driven community, a community in which we, welcome all kinds of views, we welcome all kinds of controversies. It's interesting that they're not here. Why are they not here? Are they not here because we pushed them away? Are they not here because they don't care? Because they're not invited? I mean, we could ask them, but they're not here. So that leads to a problem for us, I think. The problem is that we run the risk of getting stuck. We run the risk of getting stuck in our own ways of thinking. Now, it's easy to treat, I think, the ideas and the practices that I see associated with that community, such as it is a community. I suppose it is. I don't hear about them having... Well, I guess they're having one. Come to think of it, I'm going to the cruise this afternoon. So it's interesting that they made an effort to invite me to that, to add a little spice or a little controversy, or maybe they want to learn something from me. I'm not sure. Is that going the other way? How aggressively are we courting that kind of controversy? So, what are we all about anyway? I mentioned agnosticism, and in order to illustrate that, I want to tell you a little story. This I have to read. The story comes from a book edited by Fiona Charles, who's sitting over here. And it's a book that a bunch of us contributed to. I was very touched, in fact, to see how touched Jerry was by it. It's a book written in honor of the life and work of Jerry Weinberg on the occasion of his 75th birthday. So a bunch of us wrote a bunch of essays that we contributed to the book. This is from James Bach's essay. This is a little story. James says, I'd been visiting Jerry for a week of conversation and writing work, and we were heading up his driveway on one of our walks, when abruptly he asked, what's the first responsibility of a tester? My head, says James, was immediately brimming with candidates. I don't think I can pick one. How about 5? I'll tell you what it is, Jerry said, waving me off. He said, the first responsibility of a tester is to explore and challenge the constraints of a situation. Kind of like how you just challenge the constraints of the situation. My question, a tester, said Jerry, is someone who knows that things can be different. Isn't that fabulous? I love that. A tester is somebody who knows that things can be different. However they appear, Jerry went on, however they really are, whatever we feel about them, it could all be different than it seems, or different tomorrow than it is today. Testers need to be inquisitive, to shake things up a bit so that people can see things in a different light. Now, here's another question for you, James. What do you do if you don't have enough time to find every bug in a program? That's a trick question, James says. No one ever has the time to find every bug in a program, but that's not our goal. Our goal is usually to find every important bug. And what if there isn't time to do that? Well, that's why we use our risk analysis to guide us. We put our efforts where they're most needed. And if your risk analysis is wrong, well, that's why we also use a non-risk-oriented strategy for some of the testing. For instance, we might use a coverage-oriented technique to scan for unknown risks. And if you aren't given enough time to do that well, or maybe you have the time and you do it badly, I suppose we just keep trying, and we also try to learn from our mistakes. True. But you might not learn the right things from your mistakes. Do you see what I'm getting at, James? Said Jerry. James says, I shrugged expectantly, and he continued. Beyond any clever strategy you try, there is something further that you need, and that is a philosophy of acceptance. A philosophy of acceptance? We just accept failure? You accept reality. That's a tester's job. Your strategies will occasionally fail, no matter what you do. While a tester's first responsibility is to refuse to accept the apparent constraints of the situation, a tester must ultimately accept that some ambiguities and constraints may never be identified or resolved. It's an awkward field. If you wanted a solid ground to stand on, you chose the wrong vocation. I love that story. The reason I love that story most, I think, is because it kind of gets to the heart of where we're at in this business. Oh, there's Hobson Boyle. Look at that. See, there's the plans for the air pump, the skiing, virtual witnessing there, this thing there. Okay, there we go. The 7 principles of the context-driven school. There they are, laid out. That's what we're here about. That's what we're here for, to discuss, to work with. And if you look at each one of them, it seems that each one of them is suffused by uncertainty. Context, value of any practice depends. There are no best practices. People, boy, what could be less certain than people with politics and variability and emotions and unreliability? The product is a solution. If the problem isn't solved, the problem might not be solved. Projects evolve over time in ways that aren't predictable. Aren't predictable? Good software testing is a challenging. Only through judgment and skill. Judgment and skill, where does that leave us? Where's the certainty? Maybe we might want to ask where the desire for certainty comes from anyway. I think it comes from a desire to feel safe, to feel comfortable in a world that is complex, messy, volatile, itself not on certain grounds. Every project that we work on involves uncertainty and time pressure and risk. Why? Because every piece of software that we ever produce, every piece of software that we test, is an attempt to do something new, an attempt to do something novel. If the old stuff worked, we'd use the old stuff. We'd give people that. So we're ambitious. We take on risk. And whenever we exercise ambition, whenever we try to do something new, we are fundamentally incompetent. To some degree. Because we don't have experience with this stuff. If we had experience with it, again, we'd use the old stuff. And there's a overwhelming suspicion that the world itself is fragile. I think that's more true these days than it's been in a long time. And that process actually started if you look at the work of Marshall McLuhan, that work actually started in the 1830s and 40s when electronic communication was being developed for the first time. We're in the middle of McLuhan would argue, of a 300-year arc. We're right smack in the middle of it right now. And McLuhan observed that through history, whenever there's some kind of transformative change, the one he saw as most significant was the invention of writing itself. And then in the 16th, 15th, and 16th centuries, the evolution of movable type. and mass printing, mass communication. McLuhan saw associated with each one of those a 300-year period of generational sort of disassembly of what the world used to be like and reassembly of it based on the fact that you have to have everybody who remembers what things were like before die out before the change is really truly settled. So whenever there's a big change, and electronic media is one of them, and the rise of the computer is another, there's great turbulence, there's great uncertainty in the world. That was McLuhan's observation. And that plays out in quite apocalyptic kind of conflicts. So what does a desire for certainty look like? In the testing world, it seems to me it looks like an impulse to make testing clerical and bureaucratic. Just as with all this stuff that's going on around us, at least we can depend on these nice tidy documents, these nice tiny processes that are laid out and that don't change. The desire for certainty seems to me to be played out in the impulse to reduce testing to test cases. That is, to make testing about artifacts and not about performances. That's all I got? Come on. Come on. We started at 9:30. All right. We're going to have to go faster. Because testing based on artifacts is expensive and time-consuming, then there's a corresponding desire to reduce the number of test cases instead of increasing them. There's an impulse to delegate as much observation to machines as possible, because machines are faster at going through rote bureaucratic processes than we are. There's an impulse to spend time on busy work that prevents us from examining the product or spending time with it or interacting with it or learning it or getting experience from it. Which is interesting, because that goes back to some stuff that I noticed when I started studying qualitative research. These fellows, Kirk and Miller, in 1985, said in their book, Reliability and Validity in Qualitative Research, they said that most of the technology of non-qualitative confirmatory research is aimed at preventing discovery. That's troublesome. Right? It's troublesome to consider that we're living in a turbulent world. So what do these principles here suggest? I think one of the things that they suggest is a different form of process maturity than what people have talked about for a long time. Software projects are, after all, human activities. And humans are creatures of emotion and rationality, but primarily about emotion. It's our emotions that trigger us to look for rational explanations for things. Again, that fear, that uncertainty, that discomfort that we have with a turbulent world, that causes us to look for explanations of things that we can depend on, that we can rely on. Testing, I think, for people who believe in this stuff, is about performance, not merely about artifacts. Testing is about a recognition that we are all fallible, inexperienced, incompetent when we first encounter some new piece of technology. But the testing can help us to get better at that. Testing can help us to identify failure and adapt to it and learn from it. There's a marvelous book that's just come out in the last year or so by Tim Harford on that subject, a British economist, called Adapt. And it's about how we learn from failure, how success always comes from failure. It starts with failure. Okay. Mature people don't try to get rid of those things. Don't try to get rid of failure. We manage it. But we realize that in every activity that we pursue, every new thing that we try to learn, failure is an important part of the process. Failure gives us feedback that triggers us to find out what's wrong and make it better. That's one of the ways in which I agree with the precepts of the Agile community. When certain members of it talk very articulately about trying to make failure happen more quickly. More fault tolerant, but more quickly, so that we can learn from it and move on and improve things as we go. Mature people, it seems to me, don't have big bugaboos about failure. Mature people embrace people and the world as they are. Not as we would love them to be, but as they actually are. Messy, complex, human, emotional, turbulent, political. All right, so that's a motto that Brian Merrick identified for the test team. We're a service organization whose job is to reduce damaging uncertainty about the perceived state of the product. That sounded good to me for a while, but then I realized, wait, it's not our job to reduce uncertainty. Not exactly. It seems to me much more our job to reduce damaging certainty. It's our job to run towards a risk, to run towards the uncertainty, and to reveal it for what it is. So a key part of the service that we offer as testers is to reduce unwarranted and potentially damaging certainty about the product. Are we in the business of shoring up and maintaining illusions? Or are we in the business of demolishing unwarranted confidence? I like to think we're in the latter business. But to do so from a position of empathy, with compassion for the people who are putting this stuff together, because nobody likes having their baby called ugly. Now, another precept associated with the How to Think About Science series is that the pattern science, Schaffer suggested, is no longer theoretical physics. He said when he was a student in the 1960s and the 1970s, the paradigm of science, the crowning achievement of science, is the thing that all scientists aspired to be. He was a theoretical physicist. That's where the action really was. And he says, perhaps because science is stuck, physics is stuck, in a theoretical model that doesn't have testable experiments associated with it, string theory. Schaffer has noticed that the pattern science these days is shifting in the direction of field sciences. Things like agronomy, field botany, system sciences. Sciences that take a systems view. And, sociology, anthropology. Those sorts of things are not just about things in isolation. They're about things in relationship to other things. People in relationship to other people. The relationship between people's physical, chemical, biological, biochemical makeup and their behavior. The relationships between their behavior and other people around them. The relationships between their language and their culture. I think maybe, if we're lucky and if we continue to drive it, the testing will go more and more that way too. The testing will become more and more like anthropology. The testing will become much more of the field of the social sciences. Now, Keynote identified, for me in 2006, this notion that software testing is really a social science. Social sciences study humans. They have great tolerance for uncertainty, ambiguity. They hold ethics and values as being really important to what they do, what they examine. That it's normal for people to be in conflict, to have a diversity of approaches, a diversity of opinions, diversity of interpretations. And I like this one in particular, that observer bias is real. We accept it. We can't make it go away. We are humans after all. Instead of trying to make it go away, we manage it. We recognize it and we deal with it. We deal with conflict. We deal with controversy. We deal with bias. Because they're part of our situation. They're part of what we are as people. So if testing, my current definition, Testing is an investigation of systems composed of, yes, computer programs, but also interrelated systems. And most importantly, of people. The way people interact and try to produce value for one another, try to identify threats to value for one another. Testing itself can't make any absolute promises about what we discover in the way the world works. What testing produces, and this was the most exciting part of that talk that Kim gave way back when, was partial answers that might be useful. And that's what we do. We can't determine the absolute truth of a program. We can't determine the absolute truth of behavior. We can't be sure what people will value or how value will be threatened for them. That's what testing produces for us. That means that testing itself is a lot like anthropology. It's multidisciplinary. It's a study of people in their societies and in their cultures. It's a study of artifacts. It's a study of linguistics. I found out last night that Ellery is a linguist. I think that's a fascinating field. We had I spent a good half hour riffing on the difference between oo and e. That sort of stuff is absolutely fascinating to me because when you go a little bit deeper and look at how languages are constructed, how people say stuff, how people express themselves, how they're in some languages, verb senses and declensions and ways of referring to things that refer to a desire at some point in the past that you simply cannot say in other languages. That's fascinating to me. Isn't that like testing as well? There's certain things that you can express elegantly in one computer language that you can't express in other kinds of computer languages with anything near the same degree of ease. But next to human communication, that sort of problem in computers is relatively trivial. So, one of the lessons of anthropology that we can take away from anthropology, Wade Davis, a Canadian anthropologist, talks about this. He says that every language, every human language, is an old-growth forest of the mind. And he says it's really essential for us to collect as much as we can about these languages, many of which are dying. At the beginning of the 20th century, there were 7,000 spoken human languages. These days, there's 6,000, maybe fewer. And the last speaker of a language dies out every 2 weeks. This is an incredible and catastrophic loss of information because if we want to face the big problems of the world, we need as many different ways as we can of looking at the world. So it seems to me there's a whole bunch of different sciences, different fields of endeavor, fields of study that we can study ourselves as testers in order to advance and to move forward. Tacit and explicit knowledge, psychology, behavioral economics, philosophy, measurement. Oh boy, do we ever have things to study about measurement. I think those things allow us to see certain things that are attributable, certain things that are attributes of the context-driven approach. That we must struggle to remain skeptical, especially about what we ourselves think. That we must recognize that our knowledge is heuristic. We need to test that knowledge empirically. We need to remain diversified. We need to remain tolerant and welcoming of disagreement and different approaches. We need to become extremely skillful at using tools to extend our natural human capabilities. And we need to be adaptive. This leads to a puzzle, a problem. When we go into a testing situation, we have to recognize the context first. But the puzzle that I'm left with, and it's a puzzle I think that we might want to figure out, because being a keynote speaker, I get to propose stuff to talk about at the conference. our clients adopt or bring us on board to question their products and to some degree their processes, their relationship to the world around them. To what degree must we adopt our client's context versus adapting to our client's context? They bring us in because a tester knows that things can be different. Where do we draw the line between adopting what our clients do, how they work, how they behave, how they interact with one another? How do we adapt our behavior to that? And to what degree can we finally say, okay, that's enough. You hired me to do things my way. It's a puzzle, and it's a struggle. It's part of the paradox of being a context-driven tester. I think that being a context-driven tester centers around the skill set and the mindset of the individual tester as a contributor to a skillful and mindful and diversified team. The question is, are we really what we say we are in the context-driven community? Are we really like that? We must remain uncertain. And I have to say, by the way, just in case, I am a whiskey priest when it comes to this sort of thing. I have to question myself because I'm not sure of where I am. If people are the most important part of any project's context, we need to develop ourselves, and we need to recognize the role that we as individuals play. So I recommend this to end. First of all, the big context-driven attention. Don't let anybody tell you what to do. And yet at the same time, welcome people suggesting where you could go, where we could go. And accept some of those offers. In the process of doing that, let's build community that makes us more diverse and not just more the same. And let's talk about it. That's what we're here for. Thank you.
All right, so we have two people with microphones. If anybody has a question, hold up your green card at this point. Remember, we're here to confer.
Oh, right at the back. That's right. Number one. Really? Assignment number one?
You want a green card? If you have one, just hold it up. Make sure I see. Go ahead.
People that run projects are inherently risk averse. I would say they seek certainty, and part of that probably sits in scientific approaches to management, so-called Taylorism. How do we tackle that? How do we tackle that to try and bring them away from risk aversity and to get onto the side that, okay, yeah, we're dealing with things that we cannot answer completely. The people that you're going to join this afternoon probably sell certainty, or like to think that they sell certainty. And that probably is very appealing to some projects. How do we tackle that? How do we bring in the social science field into projects? Any good strategies then?
I don't know. But that is not only my answer, that's also my answer. Which is that we say, I don't know a lot. And we exhibit what, in a way, is very determined and very aggressive and very arrogant way Hobbes was suggesting. Hobbes was absolutely certain that he was right about epistemic humility. Right? So it's a conflict, it's a paradox. The one thing I'm sure of, or I try to be sure of, is that I don't know. And when I find myself being sure, I hope I've got, it doesn't work sometimes, but I hope I've got the demon running in the back of my head that's saying, why are you so sure? And for that is when that doesn't work, I depend on my community to help me out with that. When it comes down to trying to persuade people that certainty isn't available, I guess waiting might be an approach, because reality will come along and steamroller whatever illusions that people have about certainty eventually. But I think being it's a paradox of being aggressively humble, right? Or being absolutely certain that we've got to be not sure about things. And to act as examples. But to realize certainty isn't available, but we can produce partial answers that might be useful. With systems as complex as we're trying to produce these days, it's all right. Actual certainty isn't there to be had. So eventually reality will catch up with that.
The issue of certainty and Taylorism comes up a lot when I run into people who are anti-process. And what I like to do is these days just step back and say, wow, that sounds like me 10 years ago or 15 years ago when I was saying you should do exploratory testing if you're not. I think the keys that I'm starting to learn are to be extremely, extremely humble, just exactly like you're saying. But also, which is easy for Michael Bolton or Rob Samaranch to be so humble, not easy for everybody. But I think that what's important perhaps is to draw lessons from other people's certainties. Why are they certain? And what context factors are they able to ignore to be certain? And sometimes we can just say, well, if you ignore all of these things, then maybe we can make some conclusions. Like, for example, gravity. Does the feather really drop at the same speed as the hammer? Not at all. No way. But they do it in a vacuum. But
that's why you need an air pump. See, as I said at the very beginning, you need the air pump.
Anyhow, that's my point on that.
So you mentioned a couple of things, and when I'm out working with a client, I like to address this from two angles. One is, businesses don't like risk, but they wouldn't be in business if they were completely risk averse. There's inherent risk in business. What businesses don't like is unmitigated risk or surprises. So part of what we do is help them identify and mitigate risk. And if we can speak in their language about risk, that helps them. Helps me at least to bridge that certainty gap. And the other thing that I try to talk to them about is my job isn't to bring certainty. My job is to add value. And if the only value that you're looking for is certainty, then maybe I'm not the right person for the job. And I'm willing to stand up and say that. Now, unlike Rob and Michael, apparently I'm not so good at humble, but I am good at honest. And I'm not afraid to tell somebody, what you're asking me for is something I can't deliver. But here's what I can deliver.
I'd like to respond to something that Scott said in actually two pieces of response there. I think for too long, for my level of comfort, this whole quality assurance business, where testers are asked, is it good? Is it ready to ship? I have for a long time said, and it was inspired by Keynote, I said, we've got to get out of that business. And I have come up over a few years with colleagues of ways of saying that, or getting into that position helpfully. Little bits of linguistic shorthand. One is when we're testing, our job is not to identify whether it's good or not. That's not up to us. We don't. We're not about identifying what value there is or is not in the program in any kind of final or authoritative sense. Right? We don't get to say this is a bug or not a bug. We don't get to make that decision. That's the product owner's prerogative. We don't manage the project. What we can do is, though, I think, raise two questions. With respect to bugs, raise the question, is there a problem here? Which prevents us from getting all head up and excited about something that is a bug, but it's not really a problem. We test for the existence of problems, things that threaten value. The other thing, which I came up with a little bit more independently, but it's absolutely driven by the community, is this question. When we see risk, when we see a problem, when we see an issue, something that threatens the value of the product or something that threatens the value of the testing, or something that threatens the value of the project, or that threatens the value of the business, we don't have to scream. Right? We can relax on that a little bit. But we can identify cost, value or threats to value, and risk, and then ask this question of our clients. Are you okay with that? That, I think, puts us into a different and perhaps more humble point of view. When we're on our game, if we remember to ask, this is what we see. This is how we believe the world to be. And we tell a compelling story about that. We weave a story of our testing. But as part of that, we ask, here's what things are. Here's the story of the product. Here's the story of the testing that we've done so far, the testing that we haven't done, the testing we don't even know to do. Are you okay with that? We've got Chris at the back, number 15.
Yeah, I'm going to kill this thread because we got 2 new threads and only 2 minutes left because the speaker went over. I know we started it.
Yeah, you're talking about storytelling and weaving stories of uncertainty. But what do you do when you are required to provide some certainty and you have to weave it into your stories?
Required by whom?
By contractual obligations, by a customer, for example.